I woke up in an empty house, where every corner of the house was silent, as if those walls held a multitude of unspoken words and untold stories. Dan, my husband, was away on business again, leaving me alone with a deep emptiness. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly needed, especially in recent years when our son, Harry, began to drift away from us, as if lost in the vast seas of youth and freedom. The further he drifted into the world of parties, alcoholic fun, and fleeting liaisons, the more a sense of unease grew in me. Every night he spent with me was a new challenge. I'd sit in the kitchen, holding a cold cup of coffee to my chest, while in the back of my mind I'd thought I'd once dreamed of his laughter, his sincere gaze, the way he'd share his dreams with me. Now, however, he was just passing by, as if I was just part of the interior. It was an ordinary day when I decided to take some time to myself. I settled down in the lounge, surrounded by my favorite books and photos that captured moments of happiness. I hoped that at least for this evening I would be able to get my mind off my gloomy thoughts. But when Harry returned from university, the whole atmosphere changed. Tall, with sharp features and a bold gaze, he came in like a common storm and swept away my inner harmony. As soon as he crossed the threshold, I felt my heart beat faster. Our last meeting had ended on a heightened note. He'd answered me abruptly when I tried to ask about his plans for the weekend. I remembered how his words had taken my breath away as he looked at me with disdain, as if my concern was wearing him down. I longed for him to be that little boy again, the one who hugged me with a smile. Instead, he turned into a stranger. Harry walked into the room, and suddenly there was that familiar tension between us, like two parts of a magnet trying to push away. He looked at me with such nonchalance that in that moment I wanted to ask him to stay, to hold him close and tell him that I loved him no matter what. But I just sat there with my hands in my lap, not daring to break the silence. Gradually, feelings built up in my soul that I couldn't express. I longed for intimacy, but instead, every look he gave me, full of disdain, tore me up inside. Every time he sidelined me, I felt unwanted, lost. Every day, Harry drifted deeper into his carefree life, as if I was a part of his past that he didn't want to go back to. The sun was slowly slipping toward dusk, and the apartment was filled with soft light, when suddenly Harry turned away abruptly and closed the door of his room. I was left sitting alone, tense and depressed. I had no more energy left. I remembered again the days when he was little, when his laughter sounded like music and his smile could dispel any darkness. Cherished moments when I thought we had endless time for each other. The next day, I was alone in the house when Dan left. I sat on the couch, once again immersed in the thought that Harry was never worthy of the love I gave him. Insanity. I was going in circles, trying to figure out exactly where I had gone wrong. All this stress was weighing on my psyche, and it was getting harder every day. I remembered how fearless and free my son was when he wasn't afraid to be himself. But now, possessing everything he could, he was choosing darkness, drifting away from us with every sip of alcohol, with every new party. I felt like a ghost inhabiting my own home, stripped of all ties to reality. Suddenly, as if someone had dragged me behind them, I collapsed. The sensation of flashing darkness came over me with unexpected speed. I felt all my sorrows, fears, and vain hopes suddenly collapse like a house of cards. I fell to the floor, my heart pounding and my mind frantically racing with thoughts of the child I had devoted my whole life to. That day was a turning point in my life. I was left lying on the cold floor, face buried in the palms of my hands, and I realized how important my family was to me, and how afraid I was of losing it. I'd lost my hope, lost myself, and as I stared into the void, I realized that there was an abyss between Harry and me, a void that nothing could fill. Emptiness, but not hopelessness. This life had been divided into a before and an after, and it was in this fragile, semi-still state that I realized that time never stood still. Now all it took was simply going back to my son, ready to talk to him, and maybe start over. I lost consciousness, and the moment the world around me fell into darkness, all that was left was sensation. I felt my body, like a foreign thing, lose all control. But my mind was still with me, and I could hear it muttering softly inside, blaming me for everything that was happening. Every beat of my heart was a reminder of how I had failed. Failed to keep Harry. Failed to be a good mother. How could you? A voice whispered in my head. I imagined him choosing parties and alcohol, and every time I tried to hug him to bring him back to life, he pushed me away as if I were an empty sack. That inner voice made every moment feel like a freeze in the abyss of hopelessness. I endlessly replayed in my mind the memories of how he had laughed as a child, how he had trusted me. Where is that boy? When I finally came to my senses, barely opening my eyes, I was overcome with a feeling of utter exhaustion. I was lying on the cold floor, and before I could get up, I felt the space around me fill up. Then I heard a loud crunch, and when I pulled my head up, I saw him, Harry. He was sitting on the couch, and his face was cloudy from drinking alcohol, his hand reaching for the bottle, but his eyes were wide open. Fear. He was like a light in a dark room. Harry, I blurted out, and in that moment I noticed him look up at me sharply, as if he'd seen a ghost. Fear reflected in his eyes, and despite the alcohol, I felt like he was completely frozen in that moment. For the first time, I realized that that look wasn't just emptiness. It was surprise, the first real emotion that came over him when he looked at me after I passed out. I rose up on my elbows, my head spinning from the swelling feeling. Deep anxiety and anger enveloped me as I noticed the difficulty he was having trying to pull himself together. I couldn't avoid the words. Why? I exhaled. He rose from his seat and staggered as his foot hit an empty beer bottle on the floor. Are you dead? He said, and there was a hoarseness in his voice, like he couldn't believe I was actually here. I noticed him swallow. His alcohol-fueled speech was about to obscure his meaning. I tried to get up, but I felt weak again. The blood rushed to my cheeks, and my heart was pounding like hearing a bell ring. Harry, you're drunk, I said, trying to sound calm, even though everything inside me was tearing up. You're causing belief in your own destruction. He took a step toward me, and I saw him clench his fists convulsively. I don't want to live like this, Mary. He blurted out. I saw real struggle in his eyes, not some childish defiance common to many of his peers, but a deep, unspoken fear of incredible loss. I wasn't just referring to me, but to him. It seemed to me that he was finally beginning to realize the emptiness that could hide his days of busy partying. At that moment, there was a silence between us, filled with unspeakable tension. I slowly rose to my feet, finding his gaze and seeing in it the same fears that tormented my soul. You're not alone, Harry. I'm here for you, I whispered, even though I knew how that might sound. I was afraid I couldn't help it. He turned around as if struck by lightning, and his eyes read more than just hatred or fear, it was confusion. He stepped closer, and we were face to face, noses almost touching. The smell of alcohol filled the air, but now it wasn't just alcohol, it was a reflection of our pain, our tragedy mixed in. But what am I doing? Harry uttered, and his voice trembled as if he stood on the edge of a cliff. I've lost everything I hold dear. Those words echoed in my heart, his own torment reflected in the way he looked at me. There was such a sincere honesty in his words that I realized he didn't want to stay in this place. He didn't want to be who he had become. I slowly reached out to touch his cheek, and the moment our eyes met, I realized that this was the best start we could have had. Let's go back, I said, the thoughts swirling in my head that together we could handle whatever was pulling us apart. His face changed, fear replaced by curiosity. He tilted his head just a little, and there was something about that already. How? He asked, and there wasn't an ounce of insolence in his voice now. We start simple, let's talk. No yelling, no recriminations. Just talk. The moment he nodded slightly, I focused on the spark that flared between us. It was a journey that was just beginning, and though I was scared, it was in that fragile closeness that I felt hope. We could still change the story. I stood in front of Harry, and in his eyes I saw a spark that had once long ago faded. It wasn't a spark of insolence or defiance, it was a spark of hope, as if together we could rekindle the flame that was burning us, but could also warm our hearts. Mother, he said, his voice full of surprise and tenderness. It was as if his lips had spoken the word with real meaning for the first time. I felt a warmth surge in my chest. I want to change all that. His confession was quiet, but I heard a deep determination in it that overshadowed all the negativity I'd accumulated over the years. I took a step toward him, and that magical change between us happened again. I hugged him, and in that moment he didn't pull away, but instead wrapped his arms around me so tightly that I felt his anxiety and fear drain away. We stood like that in each other's arms, oblivious to the world around us for a moment. "I don't know how to begin," I said quietly, breaking the silence. "But I'm here to help you. We can do this together." Harry slowly pulled away and looked into my eyes. His face became serious, and his breathing was still heavy. "I just don't want to lose you again, Mary. I felt it when you fell." I trembled as I touched his hands, which were covered in small cramps. "You won't lose me. I'll always be there for you. We'll try to understand each other, like old times." We sat down on the couch, and I felt the transformation in the room begin again. This fleeting closeness no longer felt like the isolation of before. Now, instead, it became the foundation of our shared pain and hope. In that moment, the silence was no longer frightening, it was filled with the promise of a new beginning. "I abused alcohol because I didn't know how to deal with what was going on in my life," he uttered, gazing into his hands as if searching them for answers. "All this time, I thought I could do without you, and without my father in parallel." "That's okay, Harry," I echoed, trying to convey my feelings to him. "You weren't alone, and there's nothing wrong with feeling lost. We all go through it." We talked for a long time, sharing moments of our lives that we had missed. He began to talk about his fears, about how he missed intimacy, about how he was drawn to destruction, and I shared my worries and grief. Each new fragment of our lives slowly added up to a picture in which everything made sense despite the heaviness. Gradually, Harry began to share deeper thoughts. "I realize that this is my responsibility, and perhaps I need to rethink some things." His voice became more confident, and it gave me hope. I felt a spark reignite between us, a moment that turned everything around. "Remember, Harry, that you don't have to do everything on your own. You can share with me, and I'll try to understand you as best I can." At this point, he put on some courage and looked at me and said, "Will you forgive me for everything that has happened?" I sighed. "We all make mistakes, and I'm not perfect myself. But I'm here because I believe we can be better. We can support each other." Harry nodded, a warm sparkle in his eyes. We spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about old funny stories and sharing dreams. I noticed how he slowly opened up, and with each story, a new understanding shone in his eyes, the realization that I wasn't just a mom or punishment, but his life partner. A few days passed before Harry tried alcohol again. This time I could feel something different. He had decided to try and tame his fears instead of just hiding from them behind a glass. We drank tea together. The conversations were full of sincerity and lightness, and there was a sense of possibility in the air. One day, when we were looking at old photographs, I found one where he was a little boy with a wide smile on his face and the wind in his hair. I showed it to him, and his face lit up. "I don't want to be the one who forgot himself," he said. "I want that smile back." His words were a revelation to me. I felt that blind trust and faith could restore not only our relationship, but also his own journey. We started exercising together, riding bikes, going to the movies, laughing, and just being together, building a new kind of bond. Every moment we spent together became an important part of our recovery, where understanding, warmth, and the possibility of sincere joy mingled. It was as if, through all the years of struggle, we had finally found the key to unlocking the door to a new future. A few weeks passed, and the day came when I noticed that Harry was no longer hiding from me. He was laughing with his friends, showing care and consideration for those around him. I could never forget those dark moments when he would walk away from us, but they were now an important part of his experience. He took responsibility for his actions, and I could see his desire to transform his life. That spark that had sprung up between us now burned with a great flame, and I knew that even if there were challenges ahead, we would always be on the same side, ready to overcome everything together. Every weekday became an adventure that we happily traveled through. In essence, it was our journey to a new life full of light and hope. We were on the road to healing, and that was just the beginning of our story. It had been several months since the day Harry and I had begun our work together to rebuild our relationship. We were closer than ever, and every day brought new experiences I could hardly have dreamed of. We laughed, shared dreams, and most importantly, regained our trust in each other. One quiet evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in thick shades of orange and purple, Harry and I decided to go for a walk to the park that had once been our favorite place. I remembered the days when the two of us would walk along the paths, and his small, confident steps were full of anticipation. Now that we were walking side by side again, time had stopped, and it was almost magical. "Remember how you always used to start speed contests when we ran around this park?" I asked, smiling. Harry laughed, and that laugh was as fresh and invigorating as the morning rain. He snapped his fingers a few times and nodded. "Of course. I've always been first," he said with a joking arrogance, but I noticed that his eyes were shining with joy, something even deeper glowing in his inner world that cheered me up. We stopped under a huge tree, its branches shading us. I breathed in the fresh air, intending to absorb this moment, to memorialize it. In that moment, I realized that our connection had become something deeper than just a bond of kinship. It was a union based on honesty, love, and support that had blossomed again. I never thought I could feel such ease around him, as if the air around us was filled with invisible threads connecting our hearts. Harry looked at me as if he wanted to see into my very soul, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Mum," he said the word, and there was tenderness in his voice. I pulled him to me, hugging him tightly. We stood like that, and for a moment, the world around us disappeared. There was just the two of us, and a field strewn with more golden leaves, our shared history. "I know I hurt you sometimes," he continued, his voice growing serious. "But you were still there for me. You didn't let me go." I pulled away, looking at him, and in his eyes I saw a reflection of everything that had happened. "Harry, I've always believed in you. Sometimes it can be hard, like for both of us, but our love is stronger than any obstacles." His hand gently touched my face. The touch was incredibly intimate, as if he knew exactly how to take away my anxiety. I felt his warmth, and that touch rekindled sparks that had once been snuffed out. "You have no idea how much you mean to me, Mary," he said in a whisper, and in that moment it became clear to me that he was not just a son, but my ally, my protector. We both became life-affirming lights for each other. I moved closer to his lips and felt him squeeze me in an embrace, and in that embrace, all my pain, suffering, and worry seemed insignificant. The fear that had once chained us to loneliness and self-destruction was gone. We sat under the tree, and I rested my head on his shoulder. My arms were around his waist, and I felt warm inside. We were just being. In that moment, time ceased to exist, and the whole world remained outside of this infinitely cozy shell. I took a deep breath, and the freshness I inhaled was filled with the realization that we were able to find each other anew. "Promise me you won't leave me," he whispered, as if he was afraid that silence could take that closeness away from us, too. "I swear," I replied, and that word became not just a promise, but a lifelong vow of bound loyalty. The sun disappeared below the horizon and enveloped us in a thin veil of night, full of soothing sounds, the rustling of leaves and distant whispers, as if nature itself held this moment in its embrace. I turned toward him, and in that instant our lips met. With the first touch, I felt all memories of misery and disappointment dissolve, leaving only sincere love. Harry wrapped his arms around me, and I felt him tremble. It was as if he had managed to hide his true feelings all this time, but now they were playing out again, defeating the darkness. I looked into his eyes again, and they were glowing. He was mature, changed, and despite his youth, there was incredible strength in him. I saw in his gaze not only love, but gratitude, sincere and heartfelt. It was that moment when you realize that love has the power to heal, to create a relationship that can overcome any obstacle. As difficult as it was, we met challenges, sought each other out, and found the strength to build a new story. As we embraced under a dark sky studded with stars, we knew there were many challenges ahead, but now we had hope and love to light our way. Like glowing lights of peace and prosperity, the stars lead us to new accomplishments. Every moment spent with him became precious to me, and I didn't want the evening to end. I was no longer afraid of being alone because I now knew that Harry and I were connected forever. When we got home, there was a lightness in our hearts, an undeniable joy. I felt my life make sense, and as I hugged my son, I knew that together we could weather any storm. My arms held his shoulders, and in that moment I realized that this path may be thorny, but it is also filled with endless possibilities and light that we can create together.